The name she gave him was Clara Whitfield. Harvey Dunlap knew it was a lie the moment it left her lips. He stood in the doorway of his ranch house, the late afternoon sun carving long amber shadows across the dry Colorado earth, and he watched her say it with the kind of practiced steadiness that only came from years of saying a thing that was not true. Her chin lifted slightly. Her eyes met his without flinching. And there was something in the set of her jaw, some small, almost imperceptible tightening, that told him whatever name she was carrying, it was not that one. She had arrived on the afternoon stage from Denver, a single worn leather trunk at her feet and a carpetbag slung over one shoulder. Tom Briggs, who ran the general store in Cutter's Creek, had flagged Harvey down on the main road to tell him a woman had come in asking about the Dunlap ranch. Harvey had ridden into town, expecting to meet the new cook his neighbor Ward Ellison had promised to send from his contact in the city. What he had not expected was this woman, standing in the dust outside Briggs's store, wearing a dress that had once been the deep blue of a winter sky and was now faded from too many washings, with dark hair pinned back in a way that suggested she knew how to look neat even when she had nothing. She was not pretty in the obvious way of the women who sometimes pass through Cutter's Creek on their way to better places. She was striking in a way that was harder to name and harder to forget, the kind of face that made a man want to ask questions he did not quite know how to form. "Clara Whitfield," she said again, as if repeating it would make it feel more real. "I was told you needed a cook." Harvey Dunlap was 31 years old. He had been running the Double D Ranch for 7 years, ever since his father passed and left him 800 acres, a solid herd, and a reputation for being a fair man in an unfair territory. He was not a man who frightened easily. He was not a man who trusted quickly. And in this moment, standing in the heat of a June afternoon in 1882, looking at a woman who was carrying a secret so heavy it had bent the shape of how she breathed, he made a decision that would change every single thing about the rest of his life. He picked up her trunk. "Supper is at 7, he said. "I'll ask your name before then." He did not mean it as a threat. He meant it as a promise. She went very still, just for a second. Then she picked up her carpetbag and followed him to the wagon without a word. The ride from Cutter's Creek to the Double D took 40 minutes along a rutted track that cut between low brown hills dotted with sage and juniper. Harvey drove the team in silence, which he was comfortable with, because silence on the ranch was not absence, it was presence. The land spoke, if you knew how to listen. The wind off the mountains to the west carried cold in it even in summer, and the distant cattle bawled somewhere beyond the first ridge, and the harness leather creaked in a rhythm he had known since he was a boy. The woman sat beside him on the wagon bench with her carpetbag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it as if she were sitting in church. She looked at the landscape the way people looked at things when they were cataloging exits. Harvey noticed. He noticed everything about her, even the things he was not trying to notice. The way she exhaled slowly every time the wagon crested a rise and she could see more of the open country ahead of them. The way she turned just slightly each time a sound came from behind them. The way her knuckles beneath the thin fabric of her gloves were not quite relaxed. Someone was looking for this woman. He did not know who. He did not know why. But he knew the posture of a person who had been running, because he had seen it before in the territories, in men who owed debts and women who had made the mistake of trusting the wrong people, and this woman had that posture in every line of her. The Double D came into view around the last curve of the track, a solid stone and timber house, 2 barns, a bunkhouse, a chicken yard, and a kitchen garden that had been doing reasonably well since Harvey had hired old Mattie Croft to tend it. Mattie had left 3 weeks ago to go nurse her daughter in Pueblo, which was why Harvey needed a cook. "It is not fancy," he said, pulling the team to a stop before the main house. "I did not come looking for fancy," she said. He climbed down and helped her down from the wagon, which she accepted with the slightly stiff courtesy of someone who had learned to accept small gestures without allowing them to mean anything. Her hand in his was warm through the glove fabric, and she let go the moment her feet were on the ground. Rosario Vega, Harvey's foreman, came around the side of the barn at the sound of the wagon. He was a compact Mexican man of about 45 with a gray-streaked mustache and eyes that had seen the full measure of the territory's cruelties. He looked at the woman, then at Harvey, then back at the woman and said nothing, which was Rosario's version of intense scrutiny. "This is Miss Whitfield," Harvey said. "She'll be cooking." Rosario nodded slowly. "Miss Whitfield." "Evening," she said, and she looked directly at him, and Rosario, who was not a man easily impressed, glanced at Harvey with an expression that said, "This one is interesting." Harvey showed her the kitchen, which was large and well supplied, connected to the main house by a covered walkway. He showed her the small bedroom off the kitchen, which had been Mattie's and had a washstand and a narrow iron bed and a window that faced east. He told her that 3 ranch hands ate breakfast and supper with him, that Rosario took his meals with them, that he expected competent food and not ceremony, and that she should feel free to make whatever alterations to the kitchen's organization suited her working style. She listened to all of this with her arms crossed, not in hostility, but in that way of a woman who was already solving problems in her head. "I can do all of that," she said. "I know you can," he said. "That is not the part I am curious about." She met his eyes. There was that tightening again just for a second. "What time would you like supper?" "7," he said, "and before it I would like your name." He left her in the kitchen and went back to work. The afternoon was long, as June afternoons in Colorado were long, the sun rolling slowly toward the mountains without any particular hurry, and Harvey rode out to check on the north fence line, which one of the hands had reported as sagging near the creek crossing. The creek was low this year, which was a concern he carried at the back of every day, the kind of worry that did not shout but was always there, like a stone in a boot. The land needed rain. The cattle needed the creek. 700 acres of grazing land could go brittle dry in July if the seasonal rains held off, and Harvey had learned the hard way, in the drought of 1879, exactly how fast a prosperous operation could become a desperate one. He fixed the fence with young Colt Harrigan, who was 19 and talked constantly about a girl in town named Bess Altman who made pies, and Harvey let the boy talk because Colt worked harder when he was talking. By the time they were done and riding back toward the ranch house, the sky to the west had gone the deep, burning orange of a heated iron, and the temperature had dropped enough to make Harvey's shoulders release some of their habitual tension. He could smell wood smoke from the kitchen before he reached the barn. He could smell something else beneath it, onion and fat rendering, and the dry, warm fragrance of biscuit dough, and something he could not immediately name that made his stomach respond in a way that went slightly beyond hunger. He washed at the pump behind the house, changed his shirt, and went to the table. She had set it. Not grandly, but properly plate-centered, utensils laid out, a jar of wildflowers from somewhere, probably the field behind the chicken yard, placed in the middle where a plain candle usually sat. Colt Harrigan stopped in the doorway and stared at the flowers as if they were an artifact from another civilization. "She put flowers," he said. "I see that," Harvey said. The other 2 hands, brothers named Pete and Daniel Crane, who had worked the Double D for 4 years, came in and sat down and exchanged a look of mild surprise at the flowers, but said nothing because the Crane brothers maintained a general policy of not remarking on anything unless it was strictly necessary. She brought out a pot of beef stew thick with winter carrots and wild garlic, a pan of biscuits that were golden and high, and a dish of pickled green tomatoes that she must have found in the cellar from last summer's canning. She set everything on the table efficiently, without fuss, and took her place at the far end. Harvey watched her. He watched the way she served the stew, ladling it with a steady hand. He watched the way she broke a biscuit open, the steam rising from the white inside, and spread it with the butter she had found in the cold box. He watched the way she listened to Colt's rambling about the fence line and nodded in the right places without quite engaging, and the way her eyes moved occasionally to the window that faced the main track down to the road, as if she were still cataloging. She ate with genuine appetite, which told him she had not eaten well recently. She kept her posture good, which told him she had been raised with some strictness about manners. And when Pete Crane spilled his coffee and swore under his breath and then looked at her with an apologetic expression, she laughed, not a polite laugh, but a real one, brief and warm, and said, "I have done worse." And Pete Crane looked like a man who had just been handed something unexpected and did not quite know where to put it. Harvey waited until Colt and the Crane brothers had thanked her and filed out toward the bunkhouse. He poured himself another cup of coffee and one for her and set it at her place and sat back down. She looked at the coffee, then at him. "Before supper," she said. "You said before supper." "I did," he said. "I was late." She looked at the window. The sky outside was fully dark now, a wide black full of stars that Harvey had long since stopped thinking about as beautiful because they were simply the sky, the same sky every night, the sky above his land and his work and his life. But he saw her look at it for a moment as if she were orienting herself by it, the way a person did when they were not sure where they were or whether they would be somewhere else tomorrow. "Francis," she said. "Francis Reed." The name landed quietly. But it landed solidly, with the weight of a true thing after a long time of untrue things. Harvey felt it settle into the room between them, and something in him that had been waiting since the moment he first saw her in front of Briggs's store released slightly, like a wire given a little slack. "Harvey Dunlap," he said, as if they were meeting for the first time. She looked at him. "I know who you are. And I know your name," he said. "Now we are even." "We are not even," she said. "Not yet." He sipped his coffee. "No," he agreed. "Not yet." She wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at the table, and he could see something working in her, some decision being made or unmade. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft crack of settling wood in the stove and the distant sound of a coyote somewhere beyond the first hill. "I am going to need you to understand something," she said finally. "The name I came with, the other one, I needed it. I am not a criminal. I have not stolen anything or hurt anyone. But there are people who would use my real name to find me, and finding me would not be good for me, and for reasons I cannot fully explain right now, I had to be someone else when I arrived anywhere new." Harvey looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you been running?" She did not flinch from the word. 8 months. "From where?" "From Wichita." He thought about Wichita. He had been there once in the mid-1870s, a cattle drive that had ended in modest profit and considerable chaos. He knew what Wichita was, a town that had been wild and was trying to become civilized without being entirely sure it wanted to give up the wild. "Who is looking for you?" he asked. She pressed her lips together. "I said I cannot fully explain yet." "Yet," he repeated. "Yet," she confirmed. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the flowers she had put on the table. Some yellow thing he could not name, and something with small white petals that he thought might be from the field behind the south barn. He thought about the practical reality of what she was saying and what it meant for his ranch, his operation, his reputation in a small territory town where news traveled like fire in dry grass. He thought about the way she had laughed when Pete spilled his coffee, a real laugh, brief and warm. "I do not need you to explain it all tonight," he said. "But I will tell you something, Francis Reed. I have run this ranch for 7 years, and I have never had trouble brought to my door that I did not handle. If trouble comes here, I will handle it. But I cannot handle what I do not know about, and I will need to know eventually. Can you agree to that?" She looked at him across the table with the serious, measuring look of a woman who had learned not to trust agreements, and Harvey understood that look, understood the particular kind of damage that made a person look at a handshake and see instead the possibility of a door closing. "I can agree to that," she said quietly. "Good," he said. He stood up and took his cup to the wash basin. "The stew was exceptional." "Thank you," she said. He paused at the kitchen door. "Sleep with the latch on your window as well as the door. Not because of anything here, because I can see you are a person who sleeps better with latches." He did not wait for her response. He went through to the main house and sat at his desk for a long time doing the kind of non-work that passes for thinking in the dark. The next morning, she was up before him. He smelled coffee when he came down the hall at 5:30, that pre-dawn hour when the sky was still more dark than light, and the ranch hands would be stirring in the bunkhouse, but not yet to the table. She had made a full pot and had begun cutting salt pork for the pan, and she had her hair down, not entirely pinned loosely at the nape of her neck in a way that she clearly intended to fix before the men came in but had not yet gotten to. And she did not hear him come in, and he had a moment, just a moment, of seeing her as she actually was, without the careful arrangement she wore for facing the world. She was humming something. Low and tuneless, not a real song, just the kind of sound a person made when they were alone and comfortable, or as close to comfortable as they could get. He must have made a sound because she turned quickly, and the composure came back like a curtain drawn, not unfriendly but definite. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table and picked up the copy of the Denver newspaper he had left there 2 days ago, and he read or pretended to read, and she cooked, and the morning light came up slowly through the east window and painted the kitchen in gold. That was how it began, not with a declaration, not with a dramatic moment. It began with the ordinary fabric of shared mornings, the small choreography of a kitchen where two people learned to move around each other without collision, learned whose habits were fixed and whose were flexible, learned the particular silences that were comfortable and the ones that were loaded. Harvey learned that Frances Reed rose early and stayed up late, that she read when she could get books and was hungry for them in a way that told him she had not always had easy access to them, that she was gifted with anything that grew and had within a week transformed the kitchen garden from Maddie's tidy but uninspired rose into something with a personality, that she had a temper that she kept on a very short leash, and that when something provoked it, the temperature in whatever room she was in dropped several degrees in a noticeable way. Frances learned that Harvey Dunlap was quietly formidable, that his silences were not emptiness but storage, that he was the kind of man who noticed everything and said only the things that needed saying, that he was generous with his hands in ways he was not generous with his words. She watched him give Colt Harrigan extra pay from his own pocket after the boy's horse threw a shoe, and he could not afford the farrier. Watched him leave food from the ranch larder at the gate of the widow Pearson's farm 2 miles down the track without mentioning it to anyone. Watched him handle the cattle with a patience and attention that felt like respect. She noticed these things. She noticed them the way she was trying not to. The second week, Ward Ellison rode over from the neighboring ranch to collect a debt Harvey owed him for a section of new fence materials. Ellison was a big, broad man with a sunburned face and a habitual confidence that shaded easily into arrogance. He came into the kitchen for coffee without being invited, which was a territory custom that Frances was still adjusting to, and he looked at her with an appraising look that was not quite improper, but was a degree or two past friendly. "Clara Whitfield," he said, because that was the name Harvey had given Briggs in town when he collected her. "That is right," she said, because she had not told Harvey that she was ready to change the name in the wider world yet. Harvey came in from the barn and looked at the scene, Ellison at the kitchen table, Frances at the stove, the particular angle of her back, which was not hostile but was a full degree cooler than it had been before Ellison arrived, and Harvey pulled up a chair and made himself part of the conversation and kept it there, a buffer, easy and natural, so that within 5 minutes Ellison was talking to Harvey about cattle prices and Frances was free to cook without being watched. She saw it. She saw that he had done it deliberately, with no fanfare, no comment, no later reference to it. He had simply placed himself in the way of a thing that was uncomfortable for her and redirected it. She burned the edges of the cornbread slightly because she was not paying attention. He ate it without comment. In the third week, a letter arrived in Cutter's Creek addressed to the Dunlap Ranch cook, Clara Whitfield. Harvey brought it from town without opening it, which she understood as a statement of intent. He set it on the kitchen table and went back outside, and she stood looking at it for a long time before she picked it up. It was from a woman named Della Foss in Denver, who had been the one to arrange Francis's placement through Ward Ellison's contact. The letter was brief and carefully worded, which meant it was scared. It said that a man named Gerald Beaumont had been in Denver asking after a woman matching Francis's description, that he was well-connected and persistent, and that Della believed he had a lead toward Colorado territory. Francis read the letter 3 times. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and went back to starting the noon meal. Gerald Beaumont. She had known his name would surface eventually. The dark past she carried was not some vague shadow, but a man with a name and money and influence, and the particular viciousness of someone who believed that things which had once belonged to him continued to belong to him even after they had left. She had met Gerald Beaumont in Wichita in 1880, when she was 24 and working as a seamstress in the shop of a woman named Mrs. Hargrove. Beaumont was a businessman, or he held himself out as one. He had investments in cattle shipping, a share of a saloon, and a reputation for being well regarded by people whose regard was worth having. He was handsome in a studied way, and he was attentive in a studied way, and Francis had been young enough and lonely enough to mistake studied for genuine. She had been engaged to him for 3 months before she understood what he was. What he was, underneath the attentiveness and the presence and the careful management of his public image, was a man who owned things. He owned property and he owned contracts, and he owned, in his own estimation, the people who came under his influence. When Francis had told him she would not marry him, after finding out about the girl in Abilene, the one Beaumont had been keeping in a situation that was not quite respectable and not quite acknowledged, Beaumont had explained to her, in a quiet and very clear voice, that breaking an engagement was a serious matter, and that he would not be made to look foolish in Wichita. He had not threatened her physically. He had not needed to. He had simply explained the consequences. Her reputation destroyed, Mrs. Hargrove's shop ruined through pressure on suppliers, the family of a friend who had vouched for Francis facing some business difficulties he could easily arrange. It was the threat of a man who had learned that the most effective violence was the kind that left no marks. Francis had packed her trunk in the middle of the night and left. 8 months, as she had told Harvey. 8 months of arriving in towns with new names and waiting to see if the shadow of Gerald Beaumont arrived after her. 8 months of cooking and sewing and doing whatever work kept her fed and moving, always moving, never long enough in one place to feel safe. Until Della Foss had connected her to Ward Ellison's contact, and she had come to Cutter's Creek in the dry summer of 1882, to a ranch on the edge of the Colorado Territory, with a name that was not hers and a trunk full of practical clothing and one book of poetry that she had carried through everything because it was the one thing she refused to leave behind. She told Harvey that evening, not all at once and not easily. After supper, after the hands had gone, she poured them both coffee and sat down at the table, and she started at the beginning, and she told him about Wichita and Beaumont and the engagement and the night she left. And she watched him listen in the way he listened to everything, which was completely the way a man listened when he was treating the information as important and not as interesting, which was a distinction she had learned to feel. She told him about the letter. He asked 2 questions. He asked how much money Beaumont had, and he asked whether Beaumont had ever been violent in a direct way. She told him Beaumont was wealthy by territory standards, that he had connections in the cattle trade going as far as Denver and Cheyenne, and that he had never hit her, had never threatened to, but that the indirect violence of what he had done to people she cared about had been its own kind of brutality. Harvey was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the table, and she could see him thinking, working through something with the methodical focus he brought to every problem on the ranch. "He thinks you are Clara Whitfield," Harvey said. "He did until Della's letter. He may know otherwise now." "Does Della know you are here specifically?" Francis considered. She knows I am in Colorado territory. She placed me through a chain of contacts. She knows the Dunlap Ranch was the destination, yes. Could he pressure her to tell him the specific location? Yes, Frances said, because she was not going to lie to him anymore. She is not a strong woman. She tried to help me and I am grateful for it, but if Beaumont finds her and presses her, she will tell him. Harvey nodded slowly. Then we need to assume he may arrive. You do not have to be involved in this, Frances said. I can leave. I have left before. I know how to do it. You have been leaving for 8 months, Harvey said. He was not unkind when he said it. He was just stating a fact. Has leaving resolved anything? She looked at him. No, she said. Then let us try something else, he said. She felt something happen in her chest that she was not prepared for, a loosening, like a not given sudden slack, and with it came the unexpected and extremely inconvenient urge to cry, which she resisted with every remaining resource she had because she had not cried in 8 months and she was not going to start in Harvey Dunlap's kitchen over a cup of coffee. She did not cry. But it was close. What's something else, she said when she was sure her voice was steady. You stay, he said. You use your real name here. If Beaumont comes, he will find that you are employed here, that you are under the protection of this ranch, and that he has no legal claim on you. He will make trouble for you, she said. He can try, Harvey said. I mean it. He has money and he has connections and he knows how to use the law selectively when he needs to. I have a lawyer in Denver who is smarter than anyone Beaumont has ever hired, Harvey said, and I have not given him enough business lately. And I have land here and roots here and a reputation here, and I promise you, Frances Reed, that all of those things carry more weight in the Colorado territory than a Wichita businessman's pride. She stared at him. He picked up his cup and drank his coffee and looked perfectly calm, which was either genuine or the most impressive performance she had ever witnessed. Why, she said. He looked at her. Why what? Why would you do this? You do not know me. I came here with a false name and a secret and the likelihood of a powerful man making your life difficult. Why would you involve yourself? Harvey set down his cup. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was not the careful neutral he usually presented, something that had a little more depth, a little more color, like a landscape after rain. Because you told me your real name, he said. Before supper, as it turned out, not before, but still. You told me the truth when you did not have to. That is worth something to me, more than you might know. Frances looked at the flowers she had put on the table that morning. She had made it a habit now, just a small thing, a habit, and she thought about what it meant to be seen, not inspected, not assessed, seen, as in actually perceived by someone who was paying attention. All right, she said, I will stay. July came in hot and dry, which Harvey had predicted and had prepared for, having laid in extra feed and arranged a temporary water supply from the secondary spring on the southern section of the property. The cattle were restless in the heat but managed, and the ranch ran with its usual efficient rhythm, and Frances cooked and tended the kitchen garden, and occasionally rode out with Harvey to check the south fence line, because he had offered and she had found, to her own considerable surprise, that she liked being on a horse in the open country. She had grown up in Ohio, in a town called Medford, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Frances was 11, and she had moved west at 22 because her father died and her aunt in Wichita was the only family she had left. She had not been raised on horses. She had not been raised in wide open spaces. But there was something about the Colorado landscape that worked on her in a way she had not anticipated. Some combination of the scale of it, and the clean violence of its weather, and the way the mountains to the west functioned as a constant orientation, like a compass point made of stone. She and Harvey rode together in the evenings when the work permitted, which was not every evening but was enough evenings to become a pattern. They talked about practical things, the cattle, the garden, the drought, the territorial politics that were making land ownership increasingly complicated as more settlers arrived. And then they talked about other things. He told her about his father, A man named Robert Dunlap, who had homesteaded this land in 1862 with a wagon and a specific and somewhat delusional optimism, and who had died of pneumonia in 1875, leaving behind 800 acres, 12 cattle, a half-finished stone house, and a son who had spent the subsequent 7 years turning it all into something real. She told him about her father, the schoolteacher who had read to her every evening without fail, and had the kind of principled stubbornness that made him beloved by exactly the people who mattered and at odds with everyone else. She told Harvey about the book of poetry she carried. It was a collection by Emily Dickinson, published in 1890. No, she caught herself. It was the poems that circulated before publication, handwritten copies that her father had acquired from a fellow teacher who corresponded with Amherst, and she had them bound herself in Wichita, a private thing, a portable piece of what had made her who she was. Harvey asked to see it. She showed him. He read 3 poems quietly and looked up at her with an expression she could not immediately parse, something thoughtful and slightly undone. "She is saying something about secrets," he said, "in that one. About how the things we hide are the things that are most truly ours." Frances looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what she is saying." Something shifted between them in that moment on the porch in the evening light, some degree of distance that had been maintained with mutual effort, and a certain amount of unspoken agreement was suddenly less. Not gone, just less. She thought about it that night and told herself to be careful, which she knew was already a sign that careful was going to be very difficult. In the second week of July, Rosario Vega came to the kitchen at mid-morning with a look on his face that Frances had learned to read in the weeks she had been at the ranch, the look he wore when something required Harvey's immediate attention. "A rider came to the south gate," Rosario said. "He says he is looking for a woman named Frances Reed. He has a letter." Frances felt the cold drop through her stomach that she had been expecting for weeks and had not been able to stop dreading. "What does the rider look like?" "Young man, not the boss himself. Hired courier, I would say." "Where is Harvey?" "Coming from the north field. He will be here in 10 minutes." Frances untied her apron and folded it precisely on the kitchen table. She did not run. Running was not who she was, whatever 8 months of leaving had suggested. She walked to the front of the house and stood on the porch and waited. Harvey came through the barn at a steady trot, saw her on the porch, saw her expression, and pulled his horse up without needing to be told something was happening. He swung down and came to the porch with dust on his shirt and that particular stillness he carried like a physical property. "Rider at the south gate," she said, "looking for me by my real name." Harvey looked at her for 1 second. "Go inside," he said, "not because I am dismissing you. Because I need to talk to this man without you being visible yet. There is a strategy here and it starts with information." She understood. She went inside. Harvey rode to the south gate alone. The rider was, as Rosario had said, a young man of perhaps 20, clearly a paid courier, with the look of someone doing a job and not particularly invested in its contents. He handed Harvey a sealed letter addressed to Frances Reed, and said that he had been instructed to confirm delivery, and that the party who sent it would require confirmation by return message. Harvey asked for the name of the party. The young man said it was a Mr. Gerald Beaumont, staying at the Larimer Hotel in Denver. Harvey paid the courier for his trouble and told him that the message had been delivered, that Frances Reed was employed on the Double D Ranch and was in good health, and that any further correspondence could be directed to Harvey Dunlap of the Double D, Cutter's Creek, Colorado Territory. He came back to the house and gave Frances the letter. She opened it. It was written in the careful, controlled hand of a man who had composed it several times before committing it to paper. It said that Beaumont understood she had been in some distress, and that he held no anger toward her for her departure. It said that he had thought at great length about the misunderstanding between them, and that he believed a conversation would resolve everything. It said that he intended to visit the Double D Ranch at his earliest convenience, and that he hoped she would receive him with the openness their previous acquaintance warranted. He was not threatening her, not in writing. He was being perfectly reasonable, which was exactly how Gerald Beaumont operated, and which was exactly why he was so dangerous. Frances set the letter on the table. "He is coming here," she said. "I assumed as much," Harvey said. He had his hat in his hands and he turned it once slowly, a thinking gesture she had catalogued by now. "How long before he can travel from Denver?" "By stage, 3 days if the road is clear. By horse, possibly 2. Harvey nodded. "All right. I'm going to write to my lawyer in Denver, Thomas Carroll. He is a very good man and he will know exactly what Beaumont's legal standing is." "His legal standing is that I was engaged to him and broke the engagement and he lost face," Frances said. "There is no law against that." "No," Harvey agreed. "But there may be laws governing the pressure he applied to others on your behalf. We will find out." She looked at him and felt that tightening again, not the old kind, not the fear tightening but a different one, the one that had been accumulating in her chest since the evening ride when he read the Dickinson poem and understood it. It was the feeling of someone building a wall and discovering that the ground beneath it had shifted while they were working. "Harvey," she said. He looked at her. "When he comes, if he makes this difficult for you, I need you to know that you do not need to qualify anything," he said quietly. "Not to me." She looked at the letter. She looked at the flowers on the table. She looked at Harvey Dunlap, this man who had picked up her trunk with no questions and promised to ask her real name before supper and done it. This man who had read 3 Emily Dickinson poems and understood them. This man who quietly left food at the widow Pearson's gate and paid for Colt Harrigan's farrier out of his own pocket. And she thought about what it felt like to stop running. It felt, she thought, rather like arriving. Gerald Beaumont arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, 9 days after the letter, which was later than expected. He arrived in a hired wagon with a driver and a single trunk, and he was dressed in city clothes that were completely wrong for the dust and heat of the track from Cutter's Creek, which Frances suspected was intentional, a demonstration of the gap between his world and this one. She saw him from the kitchen window. She recognized the deliberate way he carried himself, the slight squaring of the shoulders that said, "I am presenting myself," and for a moment the old fear moved through her, cold and quick. Then it passed. She dried her hands on a towel, straightened her collar, and went to the front porch. Harvey was already there. She had not heard him come from the barn. He was simply there, standing in that way he had of taking up exactly the space needed and no more, thumbs hooked in his belt, looking at the approaching wagon with the expression of a man receiving a business call he is fully prepared for. "Miss Reed," Beaumont said, climbing down from the wagon, and the way he said her name had exactly the proprietary warmth she remembered, the warmth of a man who put his name on things. He looked at Harvey. "And you must be Dunlap. I have heard of your operation." "Mr. Beaumont," Harvey said, "you have traveled a distance." "I have," Beaumont said. He was perhaps 35, with a face that photographers found agreeable and that Frances had once found the same, and the kind of ease in new social situations that came from a lifetime of being considered the most important person in any room. "Frances," he said, looking at her with an expression of injured reasonableness, "I am glad you are well. I have been very worried." "I have been fine," she said. "Thank you for your concern." "I think we should talk," he said, "privately if possible." "Miss Reed is under no obligation to speak with you privately," Harvey said, in the same quiet and entirely non-combative tone he used for everything, the tone that was more effective than raised voices because it was not performing anything. "If you have something to say, you may say it here." Beaumont looked at Harvey with a recalibration that he was not quite fast enough to hide. He had expected, Frances could see him adjusting his expectations in real time. He had perhaps expected a ranch hand who might be intimidated, or a frontier employer who might be bought, or some situation that his money and his confidence and his studied charm could manage. He had not expected this particular stillness. "I understand that Miss Reed has represented our situation to you in a certain way," Beaumont said, still perfectly pleasant. I want you to know that her departure from Wichita was the result of a misunderstanding that I believe she and I can resolve between ourselves." "Is that what you believe?" Harvey said. "I was engaged to this woman," Beaumont said, and the pleasantness thinned just slightly. "We had an agreement." "An agreement she withdrew," Harvey said, "which is her right. Under circumstances that were what?" Frances said, and she heard the change in her own voice, the 10 months of accumulated forward motion, and she stepped down from the porch and looked at Gerald Beaumont directly. "What were the circumstances, Gerald? Explain them." Beaumont looked at her. She could see him doing the calculation she remembered from Wichita, the rapid, quiet assessment of whether he could control this situation by charm or whether he needed other tools. "You left without speaking to me," he said. "You did not give me the opportunity to explain about—" "Explain what?" Frances said. "Explain about Clara Moss in Abilene. Explain about what you told her. Explain about what you threatened to do to Mrs. Hargrove's business if I told anyone why I left." Beaumont's expression did not change dramatically. It never did. That was the thing about him that had frightened her most. His control was absolute, and she had spent months wondering if she had imagined the threats, had told herself the story larger than it was, had catastrophized a small cruelty into a large one. She had not. Looking at him now in the July heat in front of Harvey Dunlap's ranch house, she could see clearly what she had seen in Wichita before she left. A man who did not lose, who did not allow himself to lose, who experienced other people's choices primarily as threats to his self-conception. "I spoke with Thomas Carroll in Denver," Harvey said, "before you arrived. He has some questions about the business difficulties experienced by a Mr. Harold Fitch of Wichita in the summer of 1881. Mr. Fitch, who was a business associate of Francis Reed's friend, experienced some contract cancellations at that time. Mr. Carroll is curious whether you were involved in those cancellations." Beaumont was very still. "That is a serious accusation." "It is not an accusation," Harvey said. "It is a question. Mr. Carroll is asking it, in writing, through appropriate channels." The air between the three of them was the kind of air that did not move, the hot, heavy air of a Colorado July that pressed down on everything, and Frances watched Gerald Beaumont do something she had never seen him do in Wichita, recalculate. He looked at her. "You are happy here," he said, and it was a statement, not a question, and there was something in it that she recognized as the closest thing to acknowledgement she was ever going to get from this man. "I am," she said. He looked at Harvey. He did his calculation. He looked at Frances once more, and this time the expression was stripped of the studied warmth and the cultivated injury and the careful pleasantness, and what was underneath was not malice exactly, but it was the look of a man who had just recognized that the territory had changed and that he did not have a map for it. "Good day to you both," he said. He got back in the hired wagon. He told the driver to go. Frances watched the wagon until it disappeared around the first curve of the track. Harvey was standing beside her. She had not noticed him come down from the porch. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the dry air, and she did not move away. "Is Carroll really looking into the Fitch matter?" she asked. "He will be by tomorrow morning," Harvey said. "I wrote to him yesterday." She turned to look at him. "You prepared that as a contingency." "I prepared several contingencies," he said. "Rosario and Pete were also in the barn with clear sightlines to the front yard in case Beaumont proved less managed than he was." She stared at him. "You had a plan." "More of a range of plans," he said, "depending on what he turned out to be." "And what did he turn out to be?" Harvey looked at the empty track where the wagon had been. "A man who cut his losses," he said. "Those are the best kind to deal with. He will be back in Denver by Friday and he will find a new ambition. Men like that always do." Frances felt something extraordinary happen, the specific physical sensation of a weight she had been carrying for so long that it had become part of her posture simply lifting away, and the strange lightness that followed, the odd vulnerability of suddenly not carrying what you had been carrying, which was somehow both relief and exposure. She did not cry. She laughed. It came out of her without warning, the way the real laugh had come out that night when Pete spilled his coffee. a sudden burst of genuine, unmanaged amusement at the sheer improbability of all of it. This kitchen garden in Colorado and this man with his contingency plans and the Emily Dickinson poems and the flowers on the table and 8 months of running ending in a July afternoon on a ranch porch because a man she had known for 6 weeks had written a letter to a lawyer. Harvey looked at her, startled, and then something happened to his expression that she had not seen before, something that broke through the quiet composure and showed her a man who was deeply, genuinely pleased. And for the first time since she had met him, he looked young, or at any rate he looked unguarded, which was better. "There it is," he said softly. She looked at him, still laughing and then not laughing, and the world narrowed down to this specific moment in the specific afternoon heat. "Harvey," she said. "Francis," he said. And then, because they were both people who dealt in actual things and not in performance, and because 6 weeks of mornings and evening rides and Dickinson poems and the practical intimacy of shared work and genuine mutual attention had built something between them that did not require announcement, he reached out and pushed a strand of dark hair away from her face where the wind had blown it, very carefully, and she let him. And neither of them said anything else for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I should start supper," she said. "You should," he agreed. He did not move. "You are in my way," she said. "I am," he agreed. He still did not move. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the July heat shimmered over the ranch, and the mountains stood in the west exactly as they always had. And Francis Reed understood that she had arrived somewhere she had not known she was going. She went in to start supper. He stayed on the porch for a moment, looking at the track, and then he went back to the barn because there was always work, and because Harvey Dunlap was a man who expressed himself in continuity, in showing up, in the daily accumulated evidence of what mattered to him, and she had begun to understand that vocabulary. August came in hotter than July, which no one at the Double D thought was quite fair. The rains held off through the first 2 weeks, and Harvey spent long days managing the water supply and moving cattle to the secondary spring, and doing the kind of patient, reactive problem-solving that drought demanded. Francis kept the household running, and the kitchen garden alive with water hauled from the house well in buckets before dawn, because the garden had become important to her in a way she would have had trouble articulating, something about watching things grow in difficult conditions. Rosario taught her to rope a fence post, which was not a skill she had any practical need of but which she enjoyed with a specific and somewhat embarrassed enthusiasm. Colt Harrigan, who had by now spoken to Bess Altman of the Pies and received a reply he considered promising, had taken to bringing Francis wildflowers from town as a kind of tribute, which she accepted with a gravity that visibly delighted him. The Crane brothers, Pete and Daniel, had begun including her in conversations they would not previously have included a cook in, which she recognized as an acceptance and valued accordingly. And Harvey and she had moved into a new register, not dramatically, not with a declaration, because neither of them was built for declarations. But there was something different in the evening rides, something different in the kitchen mornings, something in the way he read the ranch accounts at his desk while she read her Dickinson poems at the table in the same room, something in the way he looked up from the accounts sometimes, and she felt his eyes and looked up from the poems, and they looked at each other with the easy acknowledgement of two people who have stopped pretending not to notice each other. In the 3rd week of August, the rains came. They came on a Tuesday evening, preceded by a sky that went green-gray and a wind that turned cold without warning, and a sound like a train coming from the west that was the thunder out over the mountains. Harvey had spent the afternoon getting the cattle to the lower field, where the drainage was good, and Francis had spent the afternoon covering the kitchen garden and bringing in the week's worth of drying herbs from the line. By the time the rain actually arrived, everything that needed to be secured was secured. They sat on the covered porch and watched the rain come across the land in moving gray curtains, heavy and purposeful, and the smell of it was the best smell in the territory, the smell of dry ground receiving water, that particular dark mineral smell that was both ancient and immediate. "It might be enough," Harvey said. "The secondary spring. Between the rain and the spring, the cattle will be fine through September. The garden will recover," she said. "Better than recover. Rain water is different from well water." He looked at the falling rain. She looked at it too. And then he said, without looking at her, in the same tone he used for talking about cattle prices and fence repairs and the property of rain water being different from well water, "I would like you to stay." She looked at him. "I am staying. I mean permanently," he said. He looked at her then, and the quiet composure was there as always. But underneath it was something else, something that was not quiet at all, something that had been accumulating in him all summer the way water accumulated in the secondary spring, slowly and with purpose. "I mean that I would like you to stay as more than the cook. I would like you to stay as I am not a man who is skilled at this particular kind of speech, and I apologize for that, but I do not think you require flowery language, and so I will simply say that I would like you to be here permanently with me as my—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. I had not finished. "I know," she said, "but the answer is yes, and I did not want you to suffer through the rest of the sentence if it was not necessary." He looked at her for a moment, and then the unguarded expression came back, the one she had seen for the first time the afternoon Beaumont left, the one that made him look young and real and entirely himself. "You are a very efficient woman," he said. "I know," she said again. The rain fell on the Double D in heavy silver curtains, and the cattle were in the lower field, and the kitchen garden was covered, and the secondary spring was filling. And Harvey Dunlap took Frances Reed's hand in both of his, and held it with the careful, deliberate quality of a man handling something he intended to keep. They were married in October. The ceremony was performed by Judge Albright, who came out from Cutter's Creek on a Saturday morning, in the main room of the ranch house with Rosario Vega, and the Crane brothers and Colt Harrigan and Old Briggs from the general store and Ward Ellison, who came out of curiosity, and left with an expression of a man who had witnessed something he had not expected to be moved by, as witnesses. Frances wore the blue dress, not the faded one she had arrived in, but the one she had sewn herself from cloth Harvey had ordered from Denver, a deep, honest blue that was not pretending to be anything other than what it was, which seemed right. Harvey wore a clean white shirt and his best coat, which Rosario had pressed the night before with the iron heated on the stove and a slightly pained expression, because Rosario felt pressing was domestic labor and beneath his dignity as a foreman. But he had done it because Harvey was not a man whose jacket should be wrinkled on his wedding day. Judge Albright performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had performed many frontier ceremonies and understood that the people involved in them were serious and did not require theatrical enhancement. He asked the necessary questions. They gave the necessary answers. Harvey slid a simple gold band onto Frances's finger. He had ridden to Denver himself to buy it, a fact he had not announced but that Rosario had mentioned to Frances in a tone of great significance, and that was that. The celebration afterward was practical and warm. Frances had cooked, because she was the cook and she wanted to cook her own wedding meal, which she told Harvey, and he did not argue with it, because he had already learned that there were things Frances did on her own terms, and that this was both a feature and not a thing to press. She made elk stew with winter vegetables from the kitchen garden, and biscuits, and a cake with dried apples and nutmeg that Colt Harrigan declared was better than anything Bess Altman had ever produced, a statement he immediately and visibly regretted having made. They ate around the long table, all of them, and Rosario opened a bottle of rye whiskey he had been saving since an occasion he no longer remembered, and they toasted the Double D and its new mistress, and Pete Crane made a short speech that was almost entirely about the excellent quality of the supper, and only tangentially about marriage, which was exactly the right kind of speech for the occasion. That night when the guests had gone and the house was quiet, Frances stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark land and the stars, which were very bright above the double D in October, the cold air of autumn stripping away whatever had hazed the sky through summer. Harvey came to stand beside her. "Still cataloging exits?" he asked. She looked at him. She thought about the first wagon ride from town, the way she had been marking the landscape, the way she had been doing it for so long it had become automatic. "No," she said, and it was true. She was not looking at the landscape as an exit. She was looking at it as the land that was hers now, the land she had come to by accident and stayed in by choice, the land that had the mountains to the west and the cattle in the lower field, and the kitchen garden that would lie fallow through winter and come back in spring, as things came back that were rooted. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood at the window of their house in the October dark, and the stars went on, and the land was quiet, and the double D was entirely and thoroughly at peace. In the spring of 1883, Frances told Harvey she was going to have a child. On an April morning when the kitchen garden had just begun to show green through the soil, and the mountains to the west still had snow on them. She told him at the breakfast table, before the hands came in, because she had been carrying the certainty for 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks deciding how to say it in a way that matched what she felt, which was a complex thing, compound and layered, happy in a way that was large enough to be a little frightening, because large happiness was something Frances had learned to be careful of. She told him plainly. She said she was expecting a child, and that she believed it would arrive in October, and she watched Harvey's face do something she had never seen it do before, which was completely and immediately transform from the habitual composed attention into something unguarded and brilliant and entirely unmanaged. And he sat very still for a moment looking at her with an expression that said everything he was not saying out loud, which was entirely consistent with how Harvey Dunlap communicated the things that mattered most to him. Then he stood up and he came around the table, and he took both her hands and held them in the way he had been holding them since the rainy night on the porch, with the same careful, deliberate quality. And he said her name, just her name, Frances, and in his voice was the whole accumulated meaning of everything between them. The trunk he had picked up without questions, the question before supper, the contingency plans, the letter to Thomas Carroll, the October wedding, the long evenings at the table with the accounts and the poems. "Frances," he said. "Yes," she said. It was their whole conversation, and it was sufficient. The child was born in October, exactly as Frances had predicted, on a cold, bright morning with frost on the kitchen garden and the smell of wood smoke in the clear air. Rosario rode at dawn for the doctor in Cutter's Creek, who was a competent young man named Dr. Harlan Price, who had been practicing in the territory for 2 years. By the time he arrived, Frances was already at the established hard work of the matter, attended by Margaret Ward, the wife of Harvey's neighbor, and a woman of no-nonsense practical experience in such affairs. Harvey waited in the main room and did not sit down once, which Rosario observed from the doorway and did not comment on, because Rosario was a man of dignity. The child was a boy. He was born at 10 in the morning with a voice that announced itself to the entire ranch yard, a sound of such determined vitality that Colt Harrigan, who was mending tack in the barn, stopped what he was doing and looked up at the house and grinned the wide, uncomplicated grin of a young man who found the world occasionally wonderful. Harvey held his son for the first time in the late morning light of the bedroom, and the boy looked up at him with the unfocused dark blue eyes of newborns, eyes that would change, Harvey knew, to some settled color. And he thought about the strangeness and the rightness of this particular October morning, this child who was the culmination of a chain of events that had started with a woman stepping down from a stage in the dust of a Colorado town with a name she had not told anyone. He looked at Frances in the bed, tired and clear-eyed and present in the way she was always present, fully and without apology. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Harvey looked at his son. He thought about his father, who had homesteaded this land with a wagon and a specific and somewhat delusional optimism. He thought about Frances's father, the Ohio schoolteacher who had read to her every evening and instilled in her the love of words that she carried now in a book of handwritten poems. "Robert," he said. "Robert James Dunlap." Frances looked at the child. "Robert," she said softly, testing it, and the child moved his small fist in what might have been acknowledgement and might have been entirely unrelated. "Yes," she said, "that is his name." The winter of 1883 was cold and long, which was not unusual for the Colorado Territory, and the Double D settled into the slower rhythms that winter imposed. The reduced but constant work of caring for the cattle in cold conditions, the long evenings by the fire, the particular luxury of time that winter allowed, time to read and talk and simply be in the house together. Robert grew with the rapid, unreasonable speed of infants, becoming by January a round and very opinionated person who had definite views about sleeping schedules that did not match anyone else's views, and by February a person who had begun to study the world with an intensity that made Harvey look at Frances and say, "He has your eyes and your thoroughness," which Frances took as the compliment it was intended to be. Thomas Carroll, Harvey's lawyer in Denver, wrote in December to say that Gerald Beaumont had relocated to San Francisco, where he had business interests in shipping, and that the inquiry into the Fitch matter had resulted in a modest but pointed legal resolution that had persuaded Beaumont to direct his energies westward and away from Colorado Territory. Carroll phrased it with the professional discretion of a good lawyer, but Frances read between the lines clearly enough. She folded the letter, set it on the fire in the main room's hearth, and watched it burn with the clean satisfaction of a chapter genuinely closed. She told Harvey what it said. He listened. He nodded. He poured them both a glass of cider from the barrel Rosario had procured in the fall, and they sat by the fire with Robert asleep between them in the cradle Harvey had made over the course of September from a piece of Douglas fir he had been saving for a project he had not yet decided on, and it had become clear in late summer that the project had decided itself. "It is over," Frances said. "It is over," Harvey confirmed. She looked at the fire. She looked at the cradle. She looked at her husband, this man who had asked her real name before supper and meant it as a promise. "I want to write to Della Fosse," she said. "I want to tell her where I am and that I am safe. I have been afraid to write to her because of Beaumont, but now that he is gone, write to her tomorrow," Harvey said immediately. "Write to her tonight if you want." "I want to invite her to visit," Frances said. "She was kind to me. She did not have to help me, and she did, and I have not been able to thank her properly." "Invite her," he said. "We have room." Frances looked at him. "You have not met her." "I have not met a great many people who matter to you," he said simply, "and I would like to." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I did not think," she said slowly, "when I got off that stage-coach in Cutter's Creek with a name that was not mine and a trunk full of practical clothes and one book of poems and no real plan except to keep moving, I did not think that it would end here, that anything would end here. I was not really thinking in terms of ending. I was thinking in terms of continuing. And now," he said. "Now," she said, "I am thinking in terms of beginning." He reached across the cradle and took her hand. It was the same gesture as always, the careful, deliberate one, and it still meant the same thing it had always meant, which was, "I am here, I am staying, I see you clearly, and this is enough, this is more than enough, this is everything." Della Fosse came in the spring, a small, brisk woman of about 50 with a sharp eye and a warm laugh who arrived on the stage from Denver with a trunk full of fabric as a gift for Frances, and a toy-carved horse for Robert, and a bottle of excellent brandy for Harvey, whom she assessed in the first 10 minutes with the experienced eye of a woman who had spent her life arranging placements, and could tell in 10 minutes whether a person was what they represented themselves to be. At the end of the first day, she took Francis aside in the kitchen and said, in a tone of brisk and definitive approval, "He is exactly what he appears to be, which is very rare. You did well, Francis." "He did the doing," Francis said. "I just told him my name." "That is all it ever takes," Della said, with the authority of someone who had thought about this. "The right person asks and you tell them the true thing. The whole rest of it follows from that." Della stayed for 2 weeks and was adopted wholesale into the life of the Double D, which she seemed to find both delightful and slightly overwhelming. She taught Francis a new method for preserving tomatoes. She played cards with the Crane brothers and beat them consistently. She held Robert in the evenings and sang to him in a slightly off-key contralto that he appeared to find entirely satisfying. When she left, she embraced Francis at the stage depot in Cutter's Creek and said quietly, "I am very glad you arrived somewhere." And Francis held her and meant every word of the goodbye. The spring of 1884 brought the rains early and sufficient, and the kitchen garden grew with a vigorous abundance that made Francis's mornings pleasurable in a specific way. The early hours in the cool earth before the heat of the day arrived. Robert in a basket near the garden fence watching the world with his very serious dark eyes. Harvey working in the north barn within shouting distance. Colt Harrigan married Bess Altman in March, in a ceremony in Cutter's Creek that the entire Double D attended, and Bess turned out to be a small, fierce, red-haired woman with an opinions about most things who took to Francis with an immediate and comprehensive enthusiasm that Francis found rather charming. They became friends, the kind of frontier friendship that was built on practical proximity and mutual respect, and Bess's pies were, as advertised, extraordinary. Harvey hired a second ranch hand that spring to manage the expanded herd, a quiet young man from New Mexico named Augustin Reyes, who spoke more Spanish than English, and got along with Rosario in a way that smoothed the workload considerably. Augustin ate his first supper at the Double D table with the expression of a man who had not expected the food to be this good, and looked at Francis with a regard that was entirely respectful and slightly awed, and said in careful English, "This is very good cooking, Mrs. Dunlap," and Francis thanked him and passed the biscuits. In August of 1884, Francis told Harvey she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening, on the porch, with Robert asleep inside and the summer dark around them and the mountains to the west gone invisible in the night, except as a darker density against the stars. Harvey looked at her with that same unguarded expression, the one that had knocked down all the walls of his composure the first time, and that still arrived with the same uncomplicated fullness each time the thing it was responding to was large enough to require it. "Good," he said, which was not the whole of what he felt but was the part of it he could say without his voice changing, and she knew the difference. "Good," she agreed. This child was a girl, born in April of 1885 when the kitchen garden was just beginning its spring emergence, and the air was still cold in the mornings and warm by noon. She was born with a great deal of dark hair and an expression, from the first moment, of profound and slightly imperious assessment. "She is already judging everything," Harvey said, holding her in the morning light. "She is your daughter," Francis said. "She is merely gathering information before drawing conclusions." "What shall we call her?" Francis thought about Ohio and her father and the schoolroom and the evenings with the lamp lit and the sound of poetry read aloud in a careful voice that had believed words were the most important things. "Eleanor," she said. "Eleanor Ann Dunlap." "Eleanor," Harvey said. The baby looked at him with her dark, assessing eyes. "She seems to approve." "She seems to be reserving judgment," Francis said. Eleanor Dunlap did not, in fact, reserve judgment on anything for long. By the time she was walking, she had established clear positions on the acceptability of various foods, the correct behavior of cattle, and the general orderliness of the kitchen, which she inspected with a thoroughness that made Rosario say, in a tone of mixed admiration and slight alarm, that the Senora was in the small one. Robert, at almost 3, received his sister with the serious courtesy of a person who had been an only child long enough to have developed a complete worldview, and was now being required to revise it. He studied her for approximately a week, and then decided she was acceptable and proceeded to include her in everything, pointing out to her the features of the ranch as she began to perceive them: the chickens, the horses, the garden, the mountains to the west, as if he were showing her his country. Harvey watched them from the barn door one September afternoon, Robert leading his baby sister. She had just begun to walk, determined and slightly unsteady, across the yard toward the fence to look at the cattle, and Francis came to stand beside him, and they watched their children together in the amber light. 800 acres, Harvey said. More than enough, she said. He looked at her. More than enough for what? For everything we are going to do with it, she said. She was smiling, not the careful managed smile she had arrived with, not the practical smile she wore in the kitchen, but the full unguarded smile that she had been learning to let out more regularly since that July afternoon when Gerald Beaumont drove away, and she laughed at the improbability of it all. The smile that was entirely Francis Reed Dunlap. Harvey Dunlap looked at his wife in the September afternoon on the land he had built, and that was now theirs together, and he felt the specific and weighty gratitude of a man who knew what he had, not abstractly but in all its practical and daily and surprising and inexhaustible particulars. He thought about the afternoon in front of Briggs's store in the dust of Cutter's Creek, the woman with the worn blue dress and the carpetbag and the false name said with practiced steadiness, and the thing in the set of her jaw that had told him the name was not true. He thought about picking up her trunk. He thought about, supper is at 7. I will ask your name before then. He thought about the way she had said Francis Reed, with the weight of a true thing after a long time of untrue things. I am glad I asked, he said. She looked at him. She knew exactly what he was talking about because she always knew exactly what he was talking about because they were people who communicated in the spaces between the words as fluently as in the words themselves. So am I, she said. Eleanor at the fence grabbed a fistful of Robert's shirt for balance and pointed at a heifer with absolute authority, and Robert explained to her, in the patient older sibling tone he was already perfecting, what a heifer was and why it was important. The mountains to the west stood in their permanent composure, and the kitchen garden was heavy with late-season tomatoes, and the double D stretched out in every direction, solid and real and entirely theirs. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because the Colorado Territory in the 1880s was not a place that permitted sustained ease. There were hard winters and dry summers and market pressures on cattle that kept Harvey at his accounts in the evenings with the methodical focus of a man doing difficult arithmetic. And there were the ordinary crises of ranch life, the sick animal and the broken equipment, and the neighbor dispute over water rights that required careful and patient navigation. And there was the vast reshaping of the territory as the railroad arrived, and the towns grew, and the open range that Harvey's father had ridden changed into something more parceled and more contested. Harvey navigated all of it the way he navigated everything, with attention, with patience, with the willingness to ask for help when help was available, and to act without it when it was not. Francis navigated all of it the way she navigated everything, directly, practically, with an eye for the essential and a willingness to make the hard decision and a stubbornness, which Harvey had understood early and loved unreservedly. That was not inflexibility, but was the stubbornness of someone who had learned the cost of yielding to the wrong things. They were an effective team in the way that good partnerships were effective, not because they were the same, but because they were complementary in ways that neither had entirely anticipated and both had come to rely on. Harvey's patience balanced Francis's urgency. Francis's directness balanced Harvey's habitual reticence. He taught her the land. She taught him, in ways he could not have fully articulated but that worked on him constantly, what it looked like to carry something heavy and still laugh at the improbability of arrival. In 1887, Harvey expanded the Double D by purchasing the adjacent 200 acres from a homesteader named Cassidy who was moving to Oregon, and the ranch became one of the more substantial operations in the Cutters Creek area, reliable and respected. The kind of place that other ranchers referred to when they needed an example of how it could be done. Robert grew into a boy who had his father's quietness and his mother's thoroughness, and a love of horses that was genuine and intense, and showed in everything he did near them. He was 7 when Harvey put him on his first horse, and the way the boy sat in the saddle had Rosario nodding slowly in the way he nodded, when something confirmed an expectation he had held for a long time. Eleanor grew into a girl who had, as predicted, definite views on most things, a quality that sometimes exhausted the household and always enlivened it. She had her father's eye for land and her mother's love of reading, and a laugh that filled rooms the way sunlight filled rooms, without announcing itself. In 1888, Francis had a third child, another boy, born in July during a thunderstorm that rattled the ranch house windows and lit the sky in intervals of brilliant white. They named him Thomas, for Thomas Carroll, who had written the letter to Gerald Beaumont's past that had helped close a door, and Carroll came from Denver to visit when the boy was 3 months old and was visibly moved by the honor in a way he masked imperfectly behind lawyer's reserve. By 1890, the Double D had Rosario as the permanent foreman, 3 full-time ranch hands, a kitchen garden large enough to supply not just the household but regular contributions to the Cutters Creek General Store, a growing reputation for the quality of its cattle, and a life that had accumulated in the way that good lives accumulated, not toward a single dramatic point, but in layers, each year adding something to the depth of what existed. Frances kept her book of Emily Dickinson poems in the same place she had always kept it, on the shelf above the kitchen table, accessible, not decorative. She had read from it enough times over the years that certain passages had transferred entirely to memory, living in her the way things lived that were so thoroughly known they had become structural. She sometimes read aloud from it in the evenings, to Harvey first and then to the children as they were old enough to listen. And Harvey, who had understood those poems on the first reading, always listened with the same expression, that look of a man receiving something important. One evening in the fall of 1890, when Thomas was 2 and Eleanor was 5 and Robert was almost 8, and the household had achieved the particular kind of organized chaos that a family with 3 children under 8 produced, and supper was over, and the younger 2 were in bed and Robert was nearly there. Harvey sat at his desk with the accounts and Frances sat at the table with her book, and Robert came out in his nightshirt to ask for a glass of water, and received it. And then stood in the kitchen doorway looking at both of them with the serious dark eyes he had been born with. "Are you happy?" he asked his mother, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that this question is complicated. Frances looked up from the book. She looked at her son and then at Harvey, who had looked up from the accounts and was watching her with the quiet attention that was as constant as the mountains to the west. She thought about a stage-coach in the dust of Cutters Creek. She thought about a worn blue dress and a carpetbag and a name she was carrying that was not hers. She thought about a man who had picked up her trunk and said, "Supper is at 7. I will ask your name before then." She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere you had not known you were going and find it was exactly where you needed to be. "Yes," she said, "very much yes." Robert considered this with the methodical gravity of someone building a philosophy. "Good," he said, in a tone that was his father's exactly, and went to bed. Harvey looked at Frances across the kitchen. Frances looked at Harvey. The fire in the stove settled with a soft sound, and the Colorado night pressed its cold hands against the windows, and the mountains stood in the dark to the west exactly where they had always been, and the Double D was everything it was and would continue to be, and Francis Reed Dunlap, who had come to Cutters Creek carrying a name nobody knew. held her book of poems, and felt the specific and weighty and entirely sufficient happiness of a woman who had told her true name to the right person at the right time and had everything that followed from it. Harvey went back to his accounts. She went back to her poems. The fire burned on. The mountains were still. Everything was, at last and without reservation, exactly and completely well.